Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us in our conference room on such short notice. As discussed earlier today, we are here to brief you, our Chief Information Security Officer, and some members of our Australian delegation on the results of our risk assessment concerning the news you gave us this morning about a possible cybersecurity incident here at the summit. The Global Five Eyes Summit begins in a couple of hours with delegation participants from our partner nations. Our host, the United Kingdom, provided us pre-summit intelligence information that suggested that we may experience cyber activity from bad actors attempting to interfere with a successful summit. We have in attendance here at the summit our partner nation delegations from the United States, New Zealand, Canada, our host, the United Kingdom, and of course ourselves from Australia. The United Kingdom has just detected additional anomalous activity on its network this morning that could result in a cybersecurity breach or create other disruptions to the summit. Our objective here is to inform you now and the other Five Eye nations later this morning on the results of our cyber team's risk assessment. We will be covering our cyber team's action plan, the control procedures we use to ensure proper authorization, access control, and authentication to our systems, the risk assessment process we followed, the detailed outcomes of our risk assessment concerning the attack vectors, threats and vulnerabilities, and recommended risk mitigation plans. And finally, we'll discuss our recommended next steps for our cybersecurity team as we continue to respond to this incident. As part of our cybersecurity team's standard operating procedures, we always begin our troubleshooting or incident response work by defining an action plan that organizes our focus and activities around refining our answers to the following four basic questions. What do we know? What have we done? What do we think? And what are next steps? Now, what do we know? We know that anomalous activity has been detected on the hosting nation's network. We also know that the host nation identifies the point of origin is internal to the summit network. What have we done? We have activated the Australian delegation incident response team and plan. We have reviewed authorization lists, access control lists, and authentication system configurations. And we have reviewed our Australian Summit network configuration guidelines on how our network should be set up securely. What do we think? We think a participating nation may be attempting to spy on the other Five Eye nations. We think this may be a distributed denial service attack. We think the Australian delegation network and information may be at risk. And we think that the Australian and other summit networks may have weaknesses needing remediation. What are next steps? We decided we will identify attack vectors, assess the risks, and make remediation recommendations. We will complete this risk assessment and communicate the results, and we will complete a forensic network scan to identify the root cause and attribution of the attack. We have executed strict procedures concerning network authorization, access control, and authentication for all delegation participants, ensuring the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of the Australian Five Eye Summit network. First, a couple of important definitions. Authorization. Authorization is the act of granting approval or denying approval for a person's access to electronic or hard copy information or physical spaces. Access control. Access control is defined as setting the rules within our system or physical spaces to enforce the authorization lists established and approved by appropriate authorities. And authentication. Authentication is defined as verifying the identity of a user, process, or device as a prerequisite to allowing access to a system or information. We followed our three-step process to ensure we will restrict all system access to only those authorized for Summit network access. First, we gained documented authorization approval for Australian delegation participants to access our Summit network from the Australian Summit Delegation Director. Second, we gained documented access control approval for each detailed system from that same Australian Summit Delegation Director so we could set up the access control rules in our systems and physical spaces, as well as set up the tools on participants' devices to enable their access. And third, we always require the Summit participants to use the proper authentication tools we provided them to gain access to our Summit systems so we know if it is verifiably them, the authorized person, such as using the multi-factor authentication app on your smartphones for system access and your badge for physical space access. We followed the risk assessment process outlined by the National Institute of Standards and Technology, or NIST for short, to complete this risk assessment, a widely accepted best practice procedure. The purpose of a risk assessment as defined by NIST is to inform and identify remediation recommendations by identifying relevant threats to organizations, vulnerabilities, risk impact, or level of harm to organizations that may occur given the probability of the vulnerability being exploited. Our risk rating process is as follows. We identified attack vectors and associated vulnerabilities we are subject to. Each attack vector and associated vulnerability identified were assessed and assigned two values, a risk rating value between 1 and 3, and a probability value between 1 and 3. Those values were multiplied to establish a risk impact value for each attack vector and vulnerability combination. All vulnerabilities with a risk impact value of 9 are rated as high risks. Vulnerabilities with a risk impact value from 4 to 6 are rated as medium risks. And vulnerabilities with a risk impact value from 1 to 3 are rated as low risks. We focused our risk assessment on the three areas of people, technology, and policy. Examples of people-related risks and vulnerabilities reviewed are insider threat, password management and complexity, phishing, and social engineering. Examples of technology-related risks and vulnerabilities reviewed are web proxies, firewalls, host configurations, and systems vulnerability patching. And examples of policy-related risks and vulnerabilities reviewed are acceptable use policies, approved software policies, and software assurance policies. We have identified 6 high-risk vulnerabilities and 3 medium-risk vulnerabilities, and we recommend that all of these be remediated according to our recommendations that we identified here. And we'll review these in detail on the next 3 slides. First, we'd like to review the people-related risks and vulnerabilities. We'll cover the attack vectors or methods used to exploit weaknesses, then the threats and vulnerabilities or the weaknesses we're protecting against, and then we'll cover our recommended risk mitigation plan to reduce the risks of the vulnerability. The first attack vector is valid network, data, and information access. The threat and vulnerability we're protecting against is insider threat, misuse of privileged access, or inadequate network monitoring. And the recommended mitigation plan is to implement improved access control procedures, Summit participant monitoring, and data loss prevention systems. The second attack vector is phishing, spear phishing, whale phishing, or malware infection. The threat and vulnerability we're protecting against is credential compromise, malware infection, no anti-phishing training, no phishing blocking systems. And the recommended mitigation plan is to implement improved phishing blocking systems, email attachment screening, and anti-malware systems. And the third attack vector is password guessing, shoulder surfing, and brute force password cracking. The threat and vulnerability we're protecting against is credential compromise, privilege escalation, poor password complexity, or no multi-factor authentication. And our recommended mitigation plan is to implement a 15-character password complexity requirement and multi-factor authentication for all systems and data. Next, we'll review the technology-related risks and vulnerabilities. The first attack vector is malware, advanced persistent threats, or crimeware. The threats and vulnerabilities we're protecting against are weak malware protections, server vulnerability exploits, network segmentation weaknesses, and intrusion monitoring system weaknesses. And the recommended mitigation plan is to implement improved vulnerability management and patching program, improved malware systems, network segmentation, and improved intrusion detection systems. The second attack vector, man-in-the-middle attacks, SQL injection, cross-site scripting, and distributed denial of service attacks. The threats and vulnerabilities we're protecting against are weak network perimeter access control, open network ports, and unpatched systems. Our recommended mitigation plans are to implement improved firewall network perimeter access, reduce and eliminate vulnerable open TCP network ports, and improve our vulnerability management and patching program. And the third attack vector is physical access to Summit host or participant computer sessions. The threat and vulnerabilities we're protecting against are unauthorized access to physical computer assets or impersonation of Summit participants. And the recommended mitigation plan is to implement biometric and multi-factor access to physical computer rooms and devices and automated session locking on devices. And here we'll review the policy-related threats and vulnerabilities. The first attack vector is Summit participant web browsing activity causing a malware infection. The threat and vulnerability we're protecting against is weak ransomware and malware protections, no internet browsing policy, and no web proxy filtering. Our recommended mitigation plan is to implement a web browsing proxy system to block bad websites and an improved web browsing policy. The second attack vector is Summit participants downloading malicious software to their devices. The threat and vulnerability we're protecting against is advanced persistent threats, malware, and ransomware. The recommended mitigation plan is to implement improved acceptable use policies, an approved software policy, and to remove local user software installation capabilities. And the third attack vector is SQL injection, cross-site scripting, or other web application attacks. And the threat and vulnerability we're protecting against is Summit web application vulnerability exploits due to weak application security, weak web development security practices. And our recommended mitigation plan is to implement improved web application development security standards and a software assurance program that includes pen testing. In conclusion, based on our risk assessment findings, we are recommending that our Australian cybersecurity team and all of the Five Eye Nation cybersecurity teams complete the following next steps. First, we recommend that we and all our Five Eye partner cyber teams continue to share breaking information about this incident. Second, we recommend we complete the risk remediation activities identified here in this risk assessment. Third, We recommend that we communicate the results of this risk assessment with the other Five Eye nations. Fourth, we recommend that we complete a full forensic network scan to identify the root cause and attribution of the attack. And finally, we recommend that we conduct a lessons learned session documenting our findings on how we reacted and performed during this incident and update our incident response plans with any improvements we identify. Thank you. And now I'd like to open it up for questions.